Well, good evening, everyone. Hope that you are happy to be here. I know I'm glad to be with you again tonight. And we're studying about what Zechariah said, despise not the day of small things. You know, I was thinking about, we've entitled this Small Things, and really what we're trying to do in the course is to prove that the things that we call small are not really small. So I don't know whether small things is a good title for the course or not. But they're small in the eyes of the world, maybe. People, events, situations, they're not the most prominent, but they are important. And that's the point we're trying to stress and to make. That each of us have a certain significance and importance, and what we say, do, and think, those things matter. They count. And we're seeing that from a number of instances in looking at some rather low-key situations that we find in the Bible. Now, last week I said we were going to look at the centurions. I intend to do that, but I've decided to postpone that for just a little bit and start tonight looking in Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. When we look at these situations, I think we can discover truth that is worth knowing. And I think that we will be better able to understand it and grasp it if we will try to imagine that we also were present at that particular moment. That we might have been more personally involved in the situation. Maybe not one of the small things, maybe just sort of sitting on the side watching, but we were there. And we might ask ourselves the question as we see these individuals doing certain things, is that what I would have done? Or would you have a suggestion that he might have done something different? And then maybe can grasp some truth from all of that. But are we able to see how small things matter? Now here in this chapter, folks, if you look at the first verses 2 through 4, we see the Lord had called His 12 apostles. And then as the chapter continues, He tells them what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to do it, talked about obstacles that they would encounter, how they could overcome those that would object to them, how they were to behave themselves when they succeeded. Just a lot of instructions given here to the apostles. And then toward the end of the chapter, verse 40, he said, "He that receiveth you receiveth me. He that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me," which of course would be the Father. "He that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man reward." Now notice this next verse. This is the one I want to emphasize. "And whoso shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward." Now I'm inclined to think that the little ones could either refer possibly and probably to the apostles, or to the ones that the apostles would influence and would teach. But whoever would give them a cup of cold water, a cup of cold water is not a big thing, is it? Now at the right time it might seem to be very pleasant and needful, but a cup of cold water, what's he talking about there? Anybody that will help them along in this task, they would be rewarded. Even though it might be such a small thing as giving a needed drink of water, and that's relatively slight, but they would receive the disciples' reward. Now, in 3 John, turn to 3 John. We read about a man over there that was commended for doing this very thing of helping out others. There are 3 people mentioned in this little chapter of 3 John. And in the first verse, as this man Gaius. When he says about Gaius, he wishes him well and so forth. But look at verse 5 and 6. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. One of the things that Gaius is being commended for here is not only that he's walking in the ways of truth, he was helping those who were helping to spread the cause of Christ. Now, this is a lesson that certainly we can learn, isn't it? That what we do, it may not ring a big loud bell, but it is of such benefit to help those of your brethren who are, like you, striving to uphold the cause of Christ. Now, there are a lot of ways that we can do that. We can do that by words of encouragement. We can do that by various means of support. We can do that by attending the gospel meetings that they uphold, trying to spread and uphold the gospel of Christ. Those things matter. You may not think it's such a big deal for, say, well, let's just say, since we're talking about old Philadelphia, and you may not think it's a big thing to go sit on those hard benches and for a while. They're not hard anymore. They got cushions on them. They don't have that back like I want, though. It makes me sit up so straight. But anyway, that keeps me awake if we had to sit up straight like that. But you know, that's a help. It's a help to the preacher that's been invited. It's a help to the brethren to helping to put on this meeting. It's a help to that particular church who's responsible for that particular service. That seems to be a small thing that I go to Philadelphia 1, 2, 3 times. But it counts. It matters. There's a cup of cold water in your hand, brethren, in my hand and yours that's coming up. Shall we give it to those who are the servants of the Lord? Well, that's the first thing I wanted to introduce. Now, the next thing, I want to mention some servants. And if you will, turn in your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 9. 1 Samuel chapter 9. Now, in this chapter, we've come to the period of history of Israel when, after Saul and David and Solomon, no, that's a little bit too far. They have been going through the judges, that's what I'm trying to think of, and the people wanted a king. They asked Samuel for a king. Samuel said, no, you do not have a king. You've got a king. God is your king. They said, oh, we want to be like the nations round about. And after all, Samuel, you're getting old and your sons are not righteous. No, they had all kinds of excuses. But what they wanted was someone to lead them, to be a captain of their people. Well, God relented and he allowed them to have a king. Now, who was this king going to be? Well, we know that the first king was King Saul. But now, how was he selected? In 1 Samuel chapter 9, we read about a man named Kish. He had this choice young man, a goodly young man who was his son, whose name was Saul. And Kish sent Saul and Saul's servant out to look for some lost asses. And he wanted to find them and to bring them back. So Saul and his servant went out looking for these animals. And it tells of all the places that they went. They went hither, there, and yon, and nowhere could they be found. And they must have spent some considerable time looking, because Saul finally said, we better get back home. Father's going to be concerned about us, be out sending out for us, and we just need to just give up for the animals and go on back. Well, the servant said, and he must have known, there's a man of God nearby, an honorable man, and what he says you can count on. Maybe he can help us and direct us to find these animals. Well, that sounded like a good idea, didn't it? To rely upon a person who was reliable. But Saul says, well, we don't have anything to be able to give him. We need to have some sort of token, some gift to be able to give him if we're going to ask this favor of him. And that was certainly benevolent of Saul. That was a good idea too. And the servant said, I've got a fourth part of a shekel. Saul didn't have anything. He must be, he's sort of like me. I go out, I don't carry money around with me, and I know why. It's not that I don't want to spend it. I lose it. I can't find it. I lose my wallet, I will lost everything I've got. So I can't lose money if I don't take it with me. So, but Saul evidently was like that. He didn't have any money. But the servant said, I've got this fourth part of a shekel. And Saul said, all right, we'll go look for him. And so they went into the city looking for the one that they called a seer. That's the name that they used to have for a prophet. And they went into the city and they found these maidens at this well. It's surprising how many times so many instances take place where maidens come to draw water, and a good work comes out of it. But anyway, they asked these maidens, is the seer here? And they said, yes, he's here, and he'll be along. You can find him. They told him where they could find him. And so when they saw him, they're going to have this connection between Samuel and Saul. And this was such an important connection, important event here in the history of God's people, the selection of their first king. God had already told Samuel, this time tomorrow, somebody's going to come to you. That's going to be the man that you're to appoint as captain of my people. So it's going to be necessary for Samuel and Saul to get together. And so they do get together. And when they get together, why, Samuel was just overly hospitable toward him, and a feast for him, and favors toward him, and everything. And the next morning, as they were leaving, Samuel called Saul off to the side and told him what this was all about. That he was going to be the one that God selected. Now, of course, we know that Saul, though he was selected, he turned out to be a very great disappointment, didn't he? So many times people start out well and they end up bad, and it's so much better even if they start out bad and end up good. But Saul, he started out good. He was a good man, but he ended up bad. But now that's going ahead of our story. The important thing is this. How important was this episode to the people of Israel? They wanted a king. A king was about to be anointed and appointed. And the right man in God's sight was Saul at this time. How important was the suggestion that the unnamed servant made? Why, it was tremendously important, wasn't it? Saul would have gone on back home without the animals and without seeing Samuel, except for his servant. And how important was the little token gift that the servant had? Why, that was very important. That's what convinced Saul to go ahead with the suggestion that was made. I suggest to you that this servant though we don't know anything more about him, played a tremendous role in the history of Israel in bringing about the first king. Do I stretch it too much? Am I exaggerating about him? I like him. I think he's a good servant, and he did a good deed. And I want to turn to another servant. And this time I want to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 14. It's right close by. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, you know, the Philistines and the Israelites were just perennial enemies. They were always fighting. It's interesting to note that when Joshua led the people in the taking of the land of Canaan, I think I've mentioned this before, he did not try to take the land of the Philistines away from them along the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. He sort of left them alone, but they were always fighting. The Philistines were continually harassing the Israelites. Well, this was an occasion during the reign of Saul when there was this conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. The son of Saul, Jonathan, and his servant went out. Notice verse 6. Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, "Come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised," that's the Philistines. "It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." Now, pause right here. You know, that's a great principle. It doesn't take the majority to be victorious. The Lord can save by many or by few. That means the few matter. The few count. If they do their job well, the Lord can use them to his benefit. So Jonathan says to his servant, "Let's go over and challenge some of these Philistines." Notice this armor bearer. The armor bearer said unto him, "Do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thy heart." You know, that verse right there is a good, lengthy definition of loyalty, isn't it? Commitment to the service of his master. What is it you want to do? We want to go tackle the Philistines. You do it. I'm with you all the way. Now that's a real committed and dedicated servant. So, some way or another, Jonathan found this out. We will pass over to these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. In other words, we will let them know we're here. Now notice 9. If they say thus unto us, "Tarry until we come to you," then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, "Come up unto us," then we will go up. For the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. I don't know how Jonathan got that sign. How he knew that sign. Some way or another it was revealed to him. Evidently God revealed to him how to handle this situation. Now they're going to go up to, here's some 20 or so Philistines. Let's go up and challenge them. Shall we fight? Well, it depends on what they say. If they say, "Come up," we'll go up. If they say, "We'll come to you," well, we'll just stay put. And they said to him to come up. So they discovered themselves to the Philistines. Verse 12, they said, "Come up to us." And then Jonathan said, "The Lord hath delivered them into our hand, into the hand of Israel." And he and his servant fell upon them and slew, let's see, I believe it said in here, verse 14, they were killed about 20 men. whatever happened here, the news of it must have spread among the Philistines. They knew they had taken a licking, and it frightened them. And they began to fight one with the other. And they fled. And when they began to flee, the Israelites pursued them. And because of this small victory that Jonathan and his servant made, and the Philistines being frightened by it, the Israelites were able to win a great battle over their enemy that day. And that was a most important and significant occasion for the Israelites. Now my question is, how important was that servant? He was loyal. He was ready to go with him. Whatever Jonathan wanted, he would stand right by him. He's not named. We don't know anything more about him as far as I know. But he contributed well in the victory for Israel that day. What if he had not done that? And what if you had been Jonathan's servant? Would you have been so anxious to go up and attack 20 men? And they did. At least they killed that many. I don't know how many they attacked. I don't know whether I'd like the odds like that or not myself. But just the same, this servant, he was a small man in many respects, but very important. There's another servant I want us to look at. Back in the book of Genesis. Now we have the name of this servant. We find his name in the 15th chapter, but we're going to study about something here in the 24th chapter of Genesis. How many of you, just a show of hands, and this is not to either embarrass you or to let you brag on your knowledge, how many of you are familiar with the name Eliezer? Hands up. Oh, we've got 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6. We got a lot of smart alecks in here. Eliezer. Well, he's the man we're going to be talking about. Eliezer. What do you know about him, anybody?
Born in Abraham's house.
All right. He was a servant of Abraham. Now, Sarah was dead, and something comes up here in the 24th chapter. Abraham said, called him in, and he made him swear to him that he would not allow his son Isaac to marry one of the Canaanite women. Now, Abraham was smart enough to know that a mixed marriage between one of God's people and a heathen was not a good tie. And so he said, swear to me you will not let that happen. And so he did. He said, I want you to go and get a woman from my people. Go back to where I came from, at least for where my people still are. And from those people, and Abraham must have thought that they had some respect for God, those people are the ones from whom you are to select a woman to come and be the wife of my son Isaac. Well, Eliezer said, what if she won't come? He said, well, if she won't come, you're released from your oath and your promise. But you go and you see if you can't get the right one. Well, come on down here to about verse 12, and we see the kind of man Eliezer is. He was on his way now, and he said, O Lord of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. Behold, I stand here by the well of water, and the daughters of men of the city come out to draw water. And let it come to pass, that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink, and she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels drink also, let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac. and thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master. What does this say about Eliezer? He was a man of prayer. He wasn't depending upon his own judgment as to the selection of the one to take back to Isaac. He was depending on God. And he was asking God to let him know who that individual should be. I'm going to be here by the well, and when these women come out, and one of them is going to ask me if I want water, and that would be the one to designate, and I'll know that that's the one that ought to go back with me. Well, after a while, here comes one named Rebekah. She asked him about the water. So he knew who it was going to be, or who it's supposed to be. And so in verse 23 he says, whose daughter art thou? Well, verse 24 says she's the daughter of Bethuel. Well, who is Bethuel? Bethuel is the son of Nahor. Well, why is that significant? Well, Nahor was a brother to Abraham. So Bethuel was Abraham's nephew, and that meant that Rebekah was one of their kinsmen. And that's exactly what Abraham was looking for, wasn't it? One of their own kinsmen. And so when she identified herself, she went back, and they went back to the household, and they got the family together, and Eliezer told them why he was there, and how that Abraham wanted her to come and to be the bride of Isaac. And so they were right kind about it. They said, well, what do you say about this, Rebekah? I would have thought sometimes they'd just say, well, okay, woman, pack up and go. But they didn't tell her to do that. Said, do you want to go? And she said, I'll go. And so she went and became the bride of Isaac. Now my question. Several of you knew about Eliezer because you have known about Abraham, and maybe you've known about this particular instance right here. Eliezer was a great man. How significant was it for Isaac to marry in the Abrahamic family? That was to keep the family of Abraham separate and apart and distinctive and unique, because it was from the family of Abraham would come Isaac, Jacob, Israel, all the way down to the time of Christ. A very significant event is taking place right here, recorded for us here, folks. And there was this lowly servant that was trusted by his master, that did his work, relying upon God, a lowly servant that contributed tremendously to the success of the nation of Israel. I think we might call him a small person, but he really wasn't all that small, was he? He was really important. Anybody have any comment or question on these three servants that I've talked about? We're going to look at one other situation here before our time runs out. All of these servants are good men. Well, let's turn next to Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17. Now, the Israelites had just crossed the Red Sea. They had come to Mount Sinai. Moses was given the law, and Israel runs into an obstacle. The Amalekites. The Amalekites were a nomadic people. I meant by that they didn't have any one particular territory in which they would inhabit. They just roamed about. They lived in tents and would attack various other neighbors, and that was the way they survived. They were a merciless, fierce, wicked people. And when Israel came into the wilderness, they attacked Israel. Well, Israel had to do something, and they, of course, would rely upon God. It was a rather interesting battle that took place. In chapter 17, we read how that Moses called Joshua in verse 9, "Choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek." Evidently Moses realized, now there's a time to try to get along, and there's a time when you can't get along. You got to fight if you're going to survive. So he said, you choose some men and go out and fight. Now you keep in mind, the Israelites were not a warlike people ordinarily, and they didn't have a lot of armament. They might have had some of the leftover armament of the Egyptians. I don't know what they had, but they couldn't have had a whole lot. But they will go out under the leadership of Joshua, and this is where Joshua begins to come to prominence. Of course, he had already been in prominence, having gone up Mount Sinai with Moses a number of times. But Joshua leads these people out to fight. Well, as the battle took place, as Moses held out his rod over the field of battle, why, the Israelites would prevail. But his arms became weary, and he would let them down. You ever try to just hold your arm out there and see how long? I don't recommend it. It's sort of stupid to do it, but I mean, it'll get so heavy after a while, you can't keep it up there. It's going to come down. And Moses would hold it up for a while, and they would prevail, but when he would let it down, no doubt the rest, why, the Amalekites would prevail. So we're introduced now to two characters, one very prominent in the history of Israel. That's Aaron, Moses' brother and mouthpiece and the first priest, high priest. And there's a him named Hur. There's a man, that's right, it's a him named Hur, H-U-R. That was his name. Now, he's not very prominent. We do read about him later on being involved in the government of Israel just a little bit, but he's not a great big character. But what did Aaron and Hur do? Well, they got a stone, and they let Moses sit down on that throne, and he would rest, and they held up his hands. And as they held up his hands, well, you know what happened. The Israelites would prevail. Now, what if they had laid his hands down, or just said, look, this is bad. Moses, you got to hold your hands up there. We're going to get beat if you don't. And just fussed at him and tried to get him to do the job. And Moses just was physically unable to continually hold his hands up there. But they decided they would help. Holding up the hands of Moses. You know, brethren, I think that's a great lesson right there. Holding up, it's sort of like the one about giving a cold water, isn't it? Holding up the hands of those who are doing the service of God. We need to hold up the hands of men who preach, if they preach soundly. We need to hold up the hands of those who take the task of leading the songs, teaching the classes, doing the benevolent work, supporting the cause of Christ in every way that they do. Hold up their hands. You may not be the leader, and you may not even be so significant that people would even notice you much. So what? That's not what's important. That the work is done. A small thing that Hur did, and Hur teaches us all a lesson. Hold up the hands of the ones that lead. He and Aaron held up the hands of Moses, and they won the battle. All right. I believe our time for tonight is about to expire. According to the clock, we've got maybe a minute or two.